Imagine being alone in your apartment late at night, with only the hum of your computer for company, when suddenly the lights begin to flicker and a mysterious voice calls your name. This is exactly what happens to Daniel, a graphic designer whose quiet night in Seattle takes a terrifying turn. As the lights pulse and the voice grows louder, Daniel can no longer ignore the feeling that something, or someone, is trying to reach him. What begins as an unsettling series of events quickly spirals into a chilling mystery that ties him to a forgotten past. Daniel is driven by curiosity and fear, determined to uncover the truth. But as he digs deeper, the line between reality and the supernatural begins to blur. Are you ready to follow Daniel on a journey where the answers may be more haunting than the questions themselves?
Behind the doors.
Daniel was absorbed in his work, the light from his computer screen reflecting off his glasses as he adjusted the details of his latest graphic design project. The vibrant colors danced on the screen, but his mind wandered far from those carefully crafted images. It was a quiet night in Seattle, with the city wrapped in a blanket of silence broken only by the faint hum of his fan. He allowed himself a sigh, trying to shake off the fatigue that was beginning to weigh on his shoulders. Suddenly, the lights in his apartment started to flicker strangely. Daniel looked up at the ceiling, frowning. "No, not now," he murmured, as if he could verbalize his thoughts and calm the electricity that seemed to dance around him. But instead of stopping, the lights increased in frequency, creating an unsettling spectacle that mirrored his growing anxiety. Maybe it's just an electrical problem, he thought, forcing himself to ignore the oddity. He returned to focus on his work, but the pulsation of the lights seemed to beat in time with the growing thump in his chest. Then, like a soft whisper, he heard his name. Daniel. He froze, the pen he was holding dropping onto the table, echoing in the silence of the apartment. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. The room remained empty, the only presence being his own ragged breathing. It was just my imagination, he tried to convince himself. But the voice echoed again, more insistent and clear. Daniel. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice mixing curiosity and fear. A heavy silence followed, as if the atmosphere itself was waiting for a response. He stood up, feeling his legs slightly tremble, and walked to the window. The night sky was clear, and the city lights shone like artificial stars, but there was nothing that could explain what was happening. As he watched the landscape, the voice returned, almost like a distant call, and he realized he could no longer ignore it. The feeling of being watched grew, and unease crept over him. This can't be real, he thought, as the pulsation of the lights became more frantic, almost like a warning. The apartment, which had once felt like a safe refuge, now became a labyrinth of uncertainties. He turned again, searching for an explanation, but the only thing surrounding him was darkness and the echo of his own nervousness. Maybe I need some time outside, he decided, feeling an urgent need for fresh air and space. As he headed to the door, the voice called out once more, and he hesitated, his hand resting on the doorknob. "What do you want from me?" he questioned, his voice trembling slightly, doubt growing within him. There was no response, but the lights flickered even more intensely, as if they were trying to convey a message. He took a deep breath and, without thinking twice, left the apartment, determined to discover the origin of those calls. He felt a chill down his spine, as if something was watching him. The voice, now more distant, seemed to guide him. "Daniel, come." The call was not just an invocation, it was a promise of answers. With a pounding heart, he advanced, each step echoing in his chest, leading him to an unknown and mysterious path. Curiosity and fear danced together in his mind as the lights of his home flickered behind him, almost like a farewell. The search for answers had begun, and Daniel knew there was no turning back. Daniel crossed the streets of Seattle, the cold night wind wrapping around him like a shroud. His heart was still racing from the strangeness of the last few hours, and the voice that seemed to echo in his mind wouldn't leave him in peace. He needed answers, and Sarah had always been his confidant, someone he could trust. The walk to her apartment felt longer than usual, each step weighted with anxiety. When he arrived, he took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell. The door creaked open and Sarah appeared, her smile lighting up the darkness of the night. "Daniel, it's good to see you. You look different. Is everything okay?" The concern in her voice was evident. "Hi, Sarah. Can we talk? It's about some strange things that have been happening to me," he said, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. She invited him in, and soon they were sitting in the cozy living room, surrounded by books and plants that Sarah carefully tended to. The environment was familiar, and that brought Daniel some comfort, but the unease in his heart did not diminish. "So, what's going on?" Sarah asked, leaning forward, interested. "It's hard to explain, but I've been hearing a voice calling my name, and the lights in my apartment have been flickering strangely. I don't know what to think," Daniel confided, looking into her eyes for understanding. "A voice? And the lights? Have you checked the wiring?" "Sometimes a short circuit can cause that," Sarah suggested, but Daniel felt it was more than that. "I thought about that, but it's not just that. The voice, it's like it's trying to tell me something. It's like there's a connection. I feel it." His voice trembled, and he felt vulnerable, exposing his fears. Sarah frowned, reflecting on what he said. "Have you ever heard of the urban legend about restless spirits trying to communicate with people they have a strong emotional connection with?" "No, I've never heard of it," Daniel replied, intrigued. "The story goes that these spirits seek out someone who can hear and understand their suffering. Maybe what you're hearing is one of those lost souls," Sarah explained, her eyes shining with curiosity. "Do you have any connection to the past? Any forgotten memories?" Daniel remained silent, diving into his own thoughts. A sense of déjà vu enveloped him, but he couldn't pinpoint its origin. "I don't know. I've always had a strange feeling about my apartment, like something was calling me. But I never thought it could be literal." "You need to investigate this, Daniel. Maybe there's something you haven't discovered yet," Sarah suggested, her voice full of encouragement. "Be careful, but don't be afraid to seek the truth." He nodded, feeling a bit more secure. "Thanks, Sarah. You always know what to say. I'll go back home and try to make sense of all this." As he said goodbye, Daniel felt a wave of gratitude for having someone like Sarah in his life. However, on the way back, the unease intensified. The lights in his apartment flickered as if trying to warn him about something important. He quickened his pace, his heart racing, and upon opening the door, the atmosphere in his home was strange, almost electric. The lights flickered even more intensely, and the voice that had once sounded distant now drew closer, as if waiting for him. "Daniel." The pronunciation was soft but full of urgency. He felt a shiver run down his spine. "Daniel, come." He hesitated, but something inside him urged him to move forward. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice echoing in the apartment's silence. The answer came in a whisper, clearer than ever. "Remember." The lights flickered even more frantically, and Daniel realized he was about to discover something that would change his life forever. Daniel walked down the hallway of his building, his heart racing and his mind full of questions. He wasn't entirely sure what he expected to find when he decided to visit Mr. Thompson, his enigmatic neighbor who always kept to himself, almost like a shadow among the other residents. The hallway lights flickered softly, reflecting the unease that had settled in his chest since the first time he heard the voice. It was as if each step he took brought him closer to a truth that had long been hidden. He stopped in front of Thompson's apartment door, hesitating for a moment. The voice calling him was more than just a whisper. It was an echo of something deep, of a connection he could barely understand. With a light knock, he rapped on the door, and the sound echoed down the silent hallway. A moment later, the door slowly opened, revealing Mr. Thompson, a man of tired appearance with gray hair and a look that seemed to carry the weight of many untold stories. "Daniel, isn't it?" Thompson said, his voice deep and gravelly, but carrying a curiosity that surprised the young man. "Yes, it's me. I would like to talk to you about some strange things that have been happening in my apartment," Daniel replied, trying to keep calm. Thompson looked around before fully opening the door, inviting him in. The apartment was dark, illuminated only by a dim lamp swaying slightly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The atmosphere was dense, almost palpable, as if the very objects were attentive to the conversation about to unfold. "Sit down," Thompson said, indicating a worn chair at a small table. Daniel obeyed, feeling slightly more at ease but still apprehensive. "I've heard a voice calling my name, and the lights. They flicker for no apparent reason. I don't know what's happening," Daniel confessed, the sincerity in his words evident. Mr. Thompson sighed, seeming to ponder his next words. He looked down at the floor, as if seeking the courage to share something very personal. "This building has an old history, Daniel. Many things have happened here. Tragedies. A young man, a boy like you, disappeared years ago in your apartment. No one ever knew what happened to him," Thompson began, his voice now tinged with sadness. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. The idea that his apartment could be connected to a tragedy terrified him, but there was a part of him that was also fascinated. He needed to know more. His name was Lucas. He was an artist. They say he had a special sensitivity to art and emotions. After he disappeared, many residents reported hearing their names whispered, just like you. The lights, the noises. It's all part of what was left behind, Thompson continued, fixing his gaze on Daniel. "And do you know what happened to him?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm not sure. But listen, Daniel, if you feel his presence, if you hear that voice, maybe it means there's a connection between you two, something that transcends time and space. He might be trying to communicate," Thompson explained, his expression now filled with concern. At that moment, the lights in Daniel's apartment began to flicker frantically, as if responding to the conversation. Daniel felt his heart race. The voice, which until then had been a distant whisper, sounded again, louder and clearer. "Daniel, did you hear that?" Daniel asked, his eyes wide. Thompson nodded slowly, and a tense silence settled between them. The old man seemed to know more than he was willing to reveal, and Daniel couldn't help but wonder what secrets he was hiding. "What do you think I should do?" Daniel insisted, his eyes fixed on Thompson, seeking answers. "Sometimes you have to face the ghosts of the past to find peace. You need to find out what Lucas wanted. And if he's calling you, maybe the answer is closer than you think," Thompson said, his gaze full of meaning. Daniel felt a mixture of fear and determination. He knew he couldn't ignore the events unfolding in his life any longer. It was time to face the truth, no matter how frightening it might be. Daniel was in his apartment, the faint light from the hanging lamp swaying gently, reflecting his internal state. The revelations about the missing young man haunted him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply intertwined with his own life. With a heavy sigh, he decided it was time to dig deeper. The first stop would be the building's library, where he had heard rumors that some old records were available to the residents. He dressed quickly, his heart racing, and left the apartment. The hallway was quiet, except for the sound of his own footsteps echoing off the walls. When he reached the library, the lighting was soft, but the atmosphere was heavy. The smell of aged books filled the air, and he sat down at a table, determined to unravel the mystery surrounding him. After a few minutes of searching, he found a file containing information about the building's history and its residents. Flipping through the yellowed pages, his eyes fixed on a name: Lucas Mitchell. The young man, who had disappeared more than a decade ago, seemed to have led a normal life until suddenly everything changed. The information was sparse, but what caught Daniel's attention the most was the description of a fateful night when Lucas was last seen. A party was taking place upstairs, and he had gone out for a walk on the terrace. A walk on the terrace, Daniel murmured to himself, remembering his own habit of standing there, watching the city at night. A strange feeling washed over his body. It was as if an invisible bridge connected him to Lucas, a thin thread linking him to a past he didn't fully understand. What had happened that night? Why had Lucas disappeared? These questions swirled incessantly in his mind as he continued reading. Then, something caught his attention. At the end of the file, there was a note mentioning a diary found in Lucas's apartment, which had been sealed by the police. Daniel felt a chill down his spine. He needed that diary. It was the missing piece in the puzzle. He hurriedly left the library and returned to his apartment. As soon as he arrived, a shiver ran down his spine. The lights began to flicker again, and the voice, soft and insistent, called his name with more intensity than ever. Daniel. Daniel. He closed his eyes, trying to control his anxiety. It can't just be a coincidence, he thought. With renewed determination, he began searching the closet in his room, where he felt something important might be hidden. And, to his surprise, after rummaging through a few objects, his fingers brushed against something rough and dusty. It was a diary, covered by a thin layer of dust. With his heart pounding, he pulled the diary out and sat on the bed. Upon opening the cover, a wave of emotion hit him. The pages were filled with notes, thoughts, and confessions from Lucas. It wasn't just a diary. It was the outpouring of a young man struggling with his own demons. "I feel like I'm being followed," one of the entries read. "It's like a shadow is behind me, and with each passing day, I feel like I'm losing my connection to reality." Daniel read carefully, absorbing every word. As he delved deeper into the entries, he began to realize that Lucas's experiences were similar to his own. The feeling of being watched, the whispering voice calling him. Everything made sense now. Then, as he reached the last pages, his hands began to tremble. The final words written were a desperate plea. "If you're reading this, please help me. I'm trapped in a place between life and death, and I need someone to find me." "What do you mean, Lucas? What are you trying to say?" Daniel murmured, as if expecting an answer. The voice echoed again in his mind, more intense, closer. The connection he felt with Lucas was growing stronger, as if the two were parts of the same puzzle, waiting to be completed. The diary was a cry for help, and Daniel didn't know if he was prepared for what it meant. Each word seemed to pierce his heart, revealing truths he still didn't fully understand. "I'll help you, Lucas," he whispered, feeling he had no choice. Their destinies were intertwined, and he knew he needed to find out what had happened that fateful night. The storm roared outside, with thunder reverberating as if the sky itself were in fury. Inside Daniel's small apartment, the electricity seemed to have a will of its own. The lights flickered frantically, as if they were dancing to the chaos unfolding outside. He was sitting on the sofa, his mind clouded by recent revelations, when suddenly everything went dark. A heavy silence took over the environment, interrupted only by the sound of his own accelerated breathing. "This can't be happening," Daniel murmured, jumping to his feet. He felt a growing pressure in his chest, as if the voice calling him was now inside him, echoing in his thoughts. With an almost uncontrollable impulse, he followed the direction of the hallway, where the darkness became more oppressive. The voice whispered again, clearer than before. "Daniel, come to me." His heart racing, he remembered the broken mirror that hung on the hallway wall. As he approached, a faint light began to emanate from the shattered glass, revealing a distorted image of himself. But beside his figure, there was another, a vaguely familiar shadow. Daniel frowned, trying to focus. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. The blurred reflection began to take shape, and the image of the young man who had disappeared became clearer. The expression on the young man's face was a mix of despair and longing. I was you." The voice echoed through the mirror. But it wasn't just a voice. It was a feeling, an emotion that transcended the barrier of time. "We are connected, Daniel. You are my reincarnation." Daniel took a step back, the impact of the revelation making his world spin. "Reincarnation? This can't be true. How is this possible?" "It's the only explanation," the young man replied, his image now almost transparent but intense. "You and I are trapped in a cycle. I couldn't find peace, and neither can you. The voice you hear is mine, trying to reach you, trying to free us." The missing young man extended his hand as if trying to reach through the glass. "You need to understand. There's something that binds us, something I left behind. The answer lies in what happened to me. But what happened? What are you trying to tell me? Daniel shouted, frustration and fear overflowing. Help me remember, the young man pleaded, the anguish in his eyes intensifying. The truth is hidden in your heart, and only you can find it. You need to confront what I couldn't. Daniel felt a wave of emotions, a mix of compassion and terror. He looked at the mirror, at the image of the young man who was, in a way, himself. But how can I do that? I don't know what you know. I don't know what happened. You're already on the right path, the voice resonated, now softer, almost like a caress. The connection you feel, the lights, the voice, it's all part of our story. Now you need to remember. You need to face what's hiding in the darkness. At that moment, the storm outside intensified, and the environment around Daniel began to vibrate. He felt the energy pulsing, an indescribable connection between the present and the past. But what if I can't? He asked, the vulnerability in his voice almost palpable. You will, Daniel. I'll be with you. We are one. The words echoed, and the image began to fade slowly, but not before leaving one last reminder. Remember, the truth will set you free. With a crack, the lights in the apartment flickered back to life, illuminating the space with an almost blinding intensity. Daniel looked at the mirror, now empty, but felt a new determination rising within him. He knew he had to move forward, that the answer was within his reach. The connection with the missing young man wasn't a burden, but an opportunity to understand not only his own past, but also the truth that had been buried amid fear and uncertainty. Daniel was paralyzed, his heart pounding in his chest. The revelation that he was the reincarnation of the missing young man left him stunned, and the voice that had been calling him now pulsed in his mind like an incessant echo. He sat on the edge of his bed, trying to process the enormity of that information. The apartment lights continued to flicker, almost as if responding to his internal agitation. The idea that his life could be linked to an old tragedy terrified him. What did it mean for him? And how could he deal with this new reality? He needed answers, and the first person that came to mind was Sarah. With a sudden impulse, he grabbed his phone and called his friend. Sarah, can you come over? I need you, he pleaded, his voice trembling with urgency. Of course, Daniel. What happened? She responded, concerned. It's complicated, just come, please, he insisted, hanging up before she could ask more questions. While waiting, Daniel got up and started pacing around the apartment, his mind racing. He stopped in front of the broken mirror, the distorted image of his reflection reminding him of the young man who he now knew was part of him. Who am I really? Daniel murmured to himself, feeling the pressure of doubt. When Sarah finally arrived, she entered without ceremony, as she always did, and immediately noticed the tension in the room. Daniel, what's going on? You look different, she said, observing him closely. I discovered something horrible, Sarah, he began, his voice almost a whisper. I am the young man who disappeared. I am him. Sarah frowned, clearly confused. What do you mean by that? Mr. Thompson told me. He said, I'm the reincarnation of that boy, and the voice calling me is my own essence trying to remember. Daniel looked into her eyes, searching for understanding. That's incredible, but you need to be sure. What else do you know? Sarah asked, her voice soft but firm. I don't know. Everything is confusing. The lights, the voice, everything feels so... I feel like there's more we need to uncover. She took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. I've always felt there was something special about you, Daniel. Now that you mentioned it, I've also felt the presence of that spirit. From the beginning, something was connecting us. What do you mean? He asked, intrigued. I don't know how to explain it. Sometimes, I feel an energy, like I'm being pulled toward a place or a memory. It's like I can see fragments of what happened. But it's all very blurry, Sarah revealed, her voice laden with emotion. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. So you're involved in this too? We need to find out the truth, Sarah. I can't go on like this, trapped in this cycle. We'll do it together, she affirmed, determined. We need to understand what really happened to you. and maybe that will help us break this connection. The two sat on the couch, surrounded by the flickering light of the apartment. Sarah began to concentrate, closing her eyes. I feel there's a place we can go, a moment when everything connects. Let's try. Daniel watched her as she seemed to slip into a soft trance. What do you see? He asked, anxiety gripping him. It's a place, a park. There's a big tree in the center, and you're there. You look happy, but there's a shadow around you. Someone is watching you, Sarah said, her voice almost a whisper. Who? Daniel asked, feeling his heart race. I don't know. This person is, she replied, opening her eyes. At that moment, the apartment door slowly opened, and Mr. Thompson entered, as if he had been waiting for the opportunity. I see you're starting to understand, he said, his voice deep and calm. Do you know who this person is? Daniel demanded, frustration overflowing. Yes, and it's more complicated than you imagine. I'm part of what happened before. I'm here to protect you, Daniel, but we need to confront the force that trapped you in this cycle. The voice you heard, is you trying to remember? Mr. Thompson explained, his deep eyes reflecting wisdom and pain. So you're saying you're part of all this? And why didn't you tell me before? Daniel questioned, feeling betrayed, but also intrigued. Because you weren't ready. But now, together, we can break this cycle and free you from your chains, he replied, a serious tone in his voice. Daniel exchanged looks with Sarah, feeling they were on the verge of a discovery that would change everything. Then let's uncover the truth. Let's end this once and for all.